My name is Lagemas George. I'm 33 years old. I am a parent and I currently work for the state of Alaska. I'm originally from Angoon. I was born in Seattle, raised in Angoon, and I've been in Juneau for about 15 years now. 15 years this December. So, growing up in Angoon was difficult, being what's commonly known as a half-breed. I'm a native black mix, and the population of Angoon is primarily full-blooded native. I was the first black child in my family, and my family had not previously participated in sort of mixed race besides white. And they didn't have the best opinions or the best outlook. And that affected the way my family treated me directly and the way my community treated me. It's really hard to get good at anything, be good at anything, be considered good at anything when you start out behind everybody else because you're a half-breed. My mother dropped me off with my grandmother when I was 2 years old, and it was to keep from bringing shame on the family. And so the beginning of my life with my family was not the best. My grandmother was not very nice sometimes, and this is fairly common in native families, but it was particularly ugly because they didn't like black people. And as much as I was half native, I was a black person. And then growing up with my grandmother, it was never documented, but I'm pretty sure she had some mental health issues. I mean, the time period that she grew up in made her a very hard person, and hard people don't understand soft people, and I've always been kind of a soft person. My earliest memory of my grandmother is getting my face shoved into the carpet because I had dropped cracker crumbs as I was sitting there eating while my mother was explaining to her that she was just dropping me off. And that was kind of the beginning of my life in that house. My sister came along and things got progressively worse because there were other factors at play. My native name, my Tlingit name, was that of one of my grandmother's sisters. One of the sisters that she didn't like. One of the sisters that used to abuse her. And that sister was dead. But in our culture, when you take someone else's name, you assume a part of the life of that person. And so there was carryover. My grandmother didn't like her sister with my name, and so she didn't like me, and it got very difficult. My sister came along and she got my grandmother's mother's name, so our great grandmother's name, who had passed away when my grandmother was very young. And so she attached an emotional sort of bubble to my sister. She needed to be protected, whereas I needed to be shown. It made life very hard. Growing up without a mother or a father in the picture, being a half-breed and being the sort of bastard child in the family that nobody really wanted, but everybody kept around because it would have been more shameful for me to go someplace else. It all emotionally and sort of mentally played a pretty heavy role in how I saw myself growing up. And it didn't seem to matter how hard I tried. Didn't matter how good I got at anything. I mean, in my peer group, I am the most culturally educated because of who my grandmother was. I, I was raised very traditionally. I can do everything that a good native woman is supposed to be able to do. I can make regalia. I can work on the food. I know my clan's songs and history. I know my grandfather's clan's songs and history. There are very few people in my age group who have had as dedicated a training as I have, but it was never enough. And school was about the only place that I excelled, and it was good. My teachers played a huge role in my life in making me feel like I wasn't less than everything. They helped me a lot growing up, and they're part of the reason I survived Angoon. Sometimes, though, they couldn't fill in those gaps. So, my attempt evolved around a particular sort of just, it had been months, and I'd been in constant trouble. I'd gotten disciplined heavily many times. I'd gotten into trouble for things that I didn't do. I'd been accused of things that I would never do. Things just, they didn't seem like they were going to get any better. And it was fish season, summer to fall. And being the good native girl that I was, I had sharpened all of my fish knives to just precision. Like, these things, I could get through a igloo cooler of fish with one knife after a good sharpening. Like, I'd gotten very good at it. And a few days, maybe a week before, I'd actually found out how sharp my knives were, because I was carrying the knives out to the smokehouse, which is where we prepare the fish, and I had dropped one knife, and I went to catch it with my left hand, and it was so sharp that the weight of the handle was enough to have it slip through my hands, and I didn't even feel the cut happening. And I opened my hand, and I've still got like the scar here from it, but I could see how deep and how clean the cut was, and that was kind of the first aha moment. Like, it could be that easy. Fish season was not the best season at home. It's a lot of tired, cranky people. It's a lot of work. Any slowness or perceived slowness is not appreciated. And I decided that I couldn't see it getting better. I didn't know if I was ever going to get out of Angoon. And I didn't know, after some of the discipline I had received, if I was going to make it out of my teen years alive, period. And it was sort of a moment of, well, why let them do it to me? Why not just do it myself? And I know people, we always talk about the signs. You start displaying supposedly all these signs that, you're thinking about it, or you're going to make an attempt. I honestly, genuinely don't remember caring enough at that point. I didn't write any letters, didn't give away any of my stuff. I guess the biggest sign was I cleaned my room, packaged everything up. That way, when I was gone, it could just be all grabbed and thrown out. That's as much consideration I gave it. But I grabbed my bucket and my knives, and I waited until everyone was asleep, and I went to my room, and I stayed up late, very late, and I sat there playing with the knife. not really thinking about anything, not that I can remember, other than there was one person that I wanted to talk to. One person, like, I felt I owed it to them to say something before I did anything, because they had always tried to care for me. And so, as I was sitting there, waiting for everyone to be asleep, I called them. And I didn't say anything about what I was planning on doing. I don't even remember using particular language. I wanted to talk to them, see how they were doing, see what was going on. I didn't used to be able to open up and tell a story back then. There are very strict guidelines about what you can tell people that aren't your family, and even what you can tell your family. And so conversation can be kind of difficult. And so I don't know if they knew what I was thinking. I don't know if I displayed anything or said anything, but I know that person stayed on the phone with me for 3 hours. And then before we got off the phone, they made me say a prayer with them. And I hadn't been religious in a long time. I lost my religion when I was very young. After an abuse incident, sexual assault incident when I was younger. And so religion's never been a comfort for me. I mean, not since then. But that time, I figured, what the hell? What's the worst that could happen? You say a prayer before you do it, and maybe you won't get sent to hell. Because that's the story. If you commit suicide, you're going to hell. And so I spent, that extra couple of minutes saying the prayer with them. And they asked if I was going to see them tomorrow. And that was kind of the sticking point. If I said no, they were going to ask what was going on, and I could probably get in trouble. Because if I attempted suicide and I failed, I was going to be in even bigger trouble. It was kind of an odd realization, like, I could potentially do this and not succeed at it, and be in an even worse situation than what drove me to this. And that's when I told them I would see them tomorrow. And that was how my first instance kind of went.
You were how old at that point?
Between 13 and 14. I can't quite remember. I was, I think, a freshman in high school, so I would have been 14.
What happened after that?
I went to school and I talked to the high school counselor. What's funny is that person's still a valuable part of my life. I didn't explain everything, but I told them what I was thinking, and they became, a pretty valuable person in my life. I never went to counseling for it. Nobody besides that person knew for a long time. Like, I didn't even talk to my friends about it, mostly because there's no such thing as a secret in the village. And so it was years later before I told anyone about it. And even longer still before I got counseling for any of the things that were bothering me. I mean, because, there's depression is pretty rampant in the Native community, especially in the villages. Uh, the socioeconomic situation out in the communities makes it very hard to see a day where you're not going to be working to survive. Just to survive. Like, there were no vacations. You didn't get to go to Disneyland. If you came to Juneau, it was because you needed supplies. And so, it's hard to see a long life like that. But, yeah, I talked to the counselor. They mentioned that, it's not always going to be like this. It'll get better. You'll get out of here. You just gotta make it through right now. And I didn't really believe them. But they helped me see a way out of Angoon. Academics. You didn't have to be great to get scholarships. You just had to be good enough. And a scholarship was a ticket out of Angoon. Even if I didn't complete a degree, I would at least get out of the village. It would be that start. And that was what I threw myself into. And, I graduated early. And yeah, I had a scholarship. It was PETA's, Preparing Indigenous Teachers for Alaska Schools. I wanted to become a teacher because after that incident, my teachers were my example that there is life outside of Angoon. And there are opportunities outside of what I knew. And so I used them sort of as the goal. I could become a teacher and move clear across the country if I wanted to, which is what most of them had done. And so I made it through high school without another attempt and started classes at the university here. I graduated a little bit early, got out in December of 2001. Yeah. And came over and started classes.
So, how many attempts have you had?
Two. There was a sort of, I don't know how to say it. It was sort of an accidental attempt. There was a situation with my son's father, where abuse was discovered. And having been abused as a child, one of my primary goals as a parent was to keep that from happening to my child. And I thought I had taken all the steps. I thought I had set up all of the best practices. And it turns out I hadn't. And I got blistering drunk. Like the kind of drunk where I was genuinely surprised I woke up the next morning. And my second direct attempt, it was people I had considered adoptive parents had taken my son, which was supposed to be for like a break for me and an opportunity for him to spend time with them. It was supposed to be for a month during the summer. Well, one of the people that he was staying with was evidently telling him stories about when he was first born and he was a baby, And I suffered some pretty heavy postpartum depression. Like, it was very difficult because I'm already depressive, and it's really easy for me to hit a down, and it's very hard for me to climb up. And so my marriage was falling apart. I had a kid that I wasn't sure I was going to be able to take care of, and I just wasn't in a good frame of mind when he was born. And sometimes it seemed like I wasn't taking care of him, or that's the way it seemed to this person. And they were telling him stories about how I would just sleep through his crying and just let him cry forever, and how they had to rescue him. In my marriage, I mean, it was pretty dysfunctional. And when I found out I was pregnant, that became my goal. In high school, the thing that got me out was my teachers. After I found out I was pregnant, that became my focus. My kid. This was going to be the reason I lived. Even if I didn't want to, I wasn't going to abandon my child the same way I was. So having them tell him this stuff and make it appear to him that I didn't want him, that I wasn't taking care of him, that he wasn't a priority to me. Like, they jokingly told him this, and they were off doing something, and he snuck one of their phones, and he called me. Like, my son called me, and he was upset. He was mad at me. And sorry, this one is harder than the first one. That wrecked me. I cried for hours by myself. And then I went to the kitchen, and I'm like, he's not here. There's nobody else here. If I did it, they wouldn't know about it for weeks. And somebody would just take care of him. And that same counselor from high school, still a friend of mine, I reached out to her, and I called her, and I asked her to come and sit with me because I was afraid to be left by myself. Because I didn't know, without my son being there, if I was personally strong enough to not do anything. And so she and her sister and her husband came over, and they sat with me for 4 hours, basically just talking me down. That time was more scary for me, and is still more emotional for me, than what happened when I was a kid. I think that time I was more genuinely at risk than when I was a teen, because now I'm an adult and I have all kinds of dangerous implements and access to a lot of things that could potentially be very harmful. And I didn't feel like I had a very strong will at that point. When I was younger, I was angry, and sometimes the anger would carry me through situations. I couldn't be angry at him for feeling bad after someone told him that. I was angry at them, but that wasn't what the problem was. The problem was my relationship with my child, who I already felt like I'd failed to protect. And then risking him feeling like I didn't care for him. Like, I'd never felt that kind of pain. And I thought I'd suffered before, but that was something else.
How are things with him now?
He's 14 now, and things are difficult. He's a 14-year-old boy. I mean, he's a good kid. He's a smart kid, he's a sweet kid, but, he's a teenager now. Mom's mom. She's too bossy, too demanding. She's kind of crazy sometimes. But I think his and I's relationship has survived our hiccups. I mean, he still tells me when something's bothering him. He still asks me for help, even if he doesn't really want to. And I feel like our relationship is good because, he'll even ask me about the embarrassing stuff. He asked me just this last school year how to ask a girl to go to the 8th grade dance with him. And it's little things like that let me know we're okay. Because not everybody's kids does that with them. So I think we're doing good.
So do you feel like you achieved what you set out to do with him?
I think I've let him down in some ways. Not in the ways that I would think of. Like, academically, I don't think I've done as much to support him as I could. And I'm not sure how I could have done more, or where I could have gotten more support for him. But I think insofar as raising him to be, intelligent and considerate and compassionate, and to think about other people when we think about ourselves, I think that I've done that. Because he and I have a lot of conversations. We're talking about what we want to be when we grow up. And he's like, I don't know what I want to do or how I'm going to do it. I know I want to do something good for other people. And this was something he volunteered on his own. It's just, what do you want to do when you grow up? You gotta think about this. And he's like, I don't know yet. I want to do good things for people. And, as a mom, that's what you want to hear your kids say. You want them to be thinking about stuff like that. And yeah, we have lots of those kinds of conversations. So as much as he drives me crazy some days, I know his head's on right and his heart's pointed in the right direction.
And you were able to raise him in a different setting.
Yeah. He didn't grow up with a lot of my native family. I limited his exposure to them because he's part Jewish. His father's of Jewish descent. And one of the things my dysfunctional family, I'm not very popular in my family because I was raised by my grandmother and taught so extensively by her. People think that was favoritism, even though it came with, a lot of discipline. But they think she played favorites by raising me. So a lot of her kids, my aunts and uncles, don't like me. And one of my aunts in particular really doesn't like me. And one of the things she had to say about me and my son was talking about my mother, how she went off and slept with some nigger fucker and came back with a little nigger baby who had a Jew baby, and our father would have never liked that. That's an actual conversation that's been had by my aunt about me and my son. And one of my uncles, who also not very fond of me when my son was born, was talking about, she should have aborted it just like she should have been aborted. And so kept him away from a lot of people in my family because I think that contributed greatly to some of the mental health issues that I deal with. And I didn't want that to be something that he had to work through too. I mean, his father has already put in his life something that he's going to have to learn to deal with and not take it out on other people and not take it out on himself. And it was a hard process. He was in counseling for several years just because he was so angry. He would get into fights. I mean, in elementary school, he would get into fights. And, he's a small kid, but he's very powerful. He's very muscular, very compact. And if he decides to throw somebody around, they're getting thrown around. And it could have been potentially very harmful to other children. And so he agreed, because I asked him to do it. He agreed to go to counseling. And he went for 4 or 5 years to get him back to a place where he was okay again. But that's the kind of relationship and the kind of atmosphere I've tried to give him. Like, he has to choose. He gets to choose. And he has to understand or think about the consequences of not doing that. Because, he got into a bit of trouble at school. And I was like, you're going to keep getting in trouble like this, and that means trouble at home. Or you can go to counseling and see if they can help you figure out how to deal with this and what to do about this and what to do with all of this so that you don't get hurt or you don't hurt somebody and you stop getting in trouble at home. And he was really young at the time, so I don't know that he grasped the fullness of the question, but he understood enough to want something different. And that's what I wanted him to understand. That's what I wanted to be able to offer him.
Do you feel like even though you kept him away from people you should have kept him away from, you were still able to pass on your culture? And did you want to?
Yes. Culture for me it's actually really important in spite of some of the negatives of it. There are some very noble attributes in our culture, in any culture, but I appreciate mine, and I have tried to instill in him, while not traditional training, the main tenets of our culture. And in 2014, he participated in his first celebration, and celebration is in honor of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, where the natives of Alaska got to reclaim traditional ancestral lands. It's a marked difference from what happened with the natives down south. Like, the natives of Alaska, actually, they have what is called native land allotments, and there were 13 corporations set up, and this was a huge success for our people. And so celebration happens every even numbered year, and native dance groups from across Alaska get together and they perform dance, they perform storytelling, they sell and share native arts and crafts. And I helped train a dance group of people my age and their children to perform at celebration, and he loved it. He had such a good time. He enjoyed, learning the songs. He enjoyed performing with the dance group. He enjoyed learning the history. I've been very fortunate. One of my uncles, one of the people that helped raise me, he's sort of our family historian. He's collected a lot of native history from elders and other storytellers, and I've got CDs of those stories, And so what my son and I used to do is, when he was younger, we lived downtown, but his daycare was in the valley. And so I'd have to drive him out to the valley in the morning before I went to work. And what we would do is we would listen to like these native storytellers on CD. And yeah, and like he knows kind of superficially all of the basics of these stories, and he can share them when he wants to. And he knows the songs and a little bit of the history. And I think he enjoys it, which is nice because for me it was a directive. You must. Right now for him it's a choice. And he enjoys that. Not all the time, but it's been fun. I have a good time with it.
What happened after that second attempt? Like, what happened then to kind of lead you to where you are now?
That was the beginning of cutting a lot of people out of my life that ended up being more toxic than helpful. Like, I don't usually believe in giving up on something, or someone for that matter. But at some point in time, you have to realize, you have to grasp and understand that not everything that comes into your life needs to stay there. And not everyone that comes into your life has to be there forever. And while these are people, when I was growing up, I never thought I would lose. Like, I never thought I would let go of them. I don't have the emotional fortitude to combat that sort of interaction between them and my son. And they weren't understanding where I was coming from. Like, I had a conversation with them about it, and it was just joking. I don't care who you are, you don't joke around with people's kids like that. Not ever. And so I started becoming more selective with the people I spent time with. I started counseling, like really started counseling. Like, I'd been in and out of counseling before, and I've done the ACEs and got told, I'm surprised you're a functioning member of society considering, and I'm like, well, yeah, it's either be a functioning member of society or not, and I've seen how those people live. I don't want to live like that. But I got into counseling. I went on medication for a while to kind of help level me out. It's not something that I can stay with for a long time, mostly because of it's a mental thing for me, the stigma of being on medication and not being able to figure it out yourself. I am unnecessarily prideful about being able to handle things myself. If there's one thing my family at large can typically compliment me on, it's I get shit done. Even if I don't want to, even if it's hard, even if they don't expect me to be able to. That's just what I do. That if you have a problem, ask Nessa, she can take care of it. Most of the people in my life can say that about me. And being on medication is like saying, I couldn't handle it. I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't make it happen. And I know that is not the case, but that doesn't change how I feel when I put that pill in my mouth. It doesn't change even after I've been taking the pills for a while and I actually feel, kind of what I imagine normal is supposed to be. And so it's a struggle. And unfortunately, I go on and off. I would probably benefit from being on regularly, but maybe I'll get there someday. But today's not that day, and tomorrow's not looking good either.
How do you feel now?
Life has gotten difficult again, and it's better now. than it was in the past, because I feel like I've got a better circle of support. I've got people around me that they see me in a way that I don't think I had been seen growing up or in previous relationships. So I feel like I've got more people aware of me and my ups and downs. I've learned how to reach out to people better. Like, I've learned not to try and do it by myself. Like, even as prideful as I am, the relationship with that particular counselor friend of mine has become such that, like, they forcibly taught me how to rely on other people. Not in a negative way, but they wouldn't, for a long while, they wouldn't leave me alone. It was, come over to dinner. There's no arguing, you're just coming over to dinner. No, you need to come and hang out with us, we're just gonna play cards. Like, it was like forced interaction, positive interaction with people who didn't want anything other than my company and to know that I was doing well. And that went a long way into teaching me how to let other people in, and actually in. Not the, at arm's length in, not in the vicinity in, but actually knowing that somebody cared about me for no other reason than they wanted to. There was no give and take. There was just a whole lot of give. And that helped a lot. Another thing that I got involved in was the suicide prevention talks with the school district here. And that, I think, has helped me a bit too. Being able to talk with these other kids, with these kids, about knowing what it's like to be on that side of the fence, on that side of the table, knowing how it feels. Maybe not knowing exactly what they're thinking, but having an idea of what's going through their head, or why they're thinking that way about things, or what could be influencing those thoughts. Other people on the panel are usually the friends and family of the survivors, and their perspective is valuable and it is needed, but I think sometimes it's a bit more jarring when you hear from an attempt survivor, when you're sitting across from them and they're telling you their story, and you see how hard it is for them, but you see how hard they're working at it, and that it's possible even when you've attempted, like even when you've sat there and actually contemplated what it would be like to go through with it. To know that if you do and you survive, you can survive. Not just exist, but you can go on, you can do other stuff. And then to hear about how sometimes it doesn't go away. I was talking to someone about it just today. They were surprised to hear that I was a attempt survivor. 'Cause you seem so happy. And I'm like, well, even happy people get low. And sometimes you have to pretend to be happy, even when you're miserable. Because not everybody wants to hear about, well, you tried to commit suicide, what's wrong with you? And they're like, well, yeah, but it's better now, right? Not really. I mean, not in the way everybody expects it to be. They think, like, once you've gotten past that knee-jerk, I'm gonna do it, that it goes away. And unfortunately, at least in my instance, it hasn't. If things get bad enough, if I get low enough, if I don't reach out, if I don't use any of the mechanisms for dealing with what's going on in my head and how I feel, I mean, it's always there. I mean, I considered it once. I thought it was a valid, option, not once, but twice. I almost did it by accident one time. That doesn't, at least for me, just go away. But I try to take into consideration, what it would do to my son. My counselor friend, their stepson committed suicide. And there weren't really any warning signs. They did have mental health issues, but there was no preparing for it. There was no trying to stop it. There was just dealing with it afterwards. And having to have a conversation with my young child about that, because he was really close to the person who committed suicide. Having to explain to him that this person was sick and that they were in a very bad place and they didn't know how to deal with it. Remembering having that conversation is something that's always there for me now as well. As low as I get, as bad as I feel, as many times as I think of it, I have to think about somebody else having to have that conversation with my son, except for this time it's about his mother. How she couldn't, or she wouldn't, or she didn't know how. And I don't think it would be right to put that on him at this point, or really any point in his life, but particularly at this point. I mean, he's 14 now. Life's gonna be hard enough as it is. And it would be just a different type of walking out on him, which is something that I lived through. And I told myself I wouldn't do that to him. And so these are things, when all else fails, these are things I fall back on.
Talk to me about Alaska and the high suicide rate. What that's about. I'm giving broad strokes for now.
Well, Alaska is a very beautiful, very unique, very isolated place. The community I grew up in, at its largest during the summer, is about 500 people. Yeah, there are more kids in the high school senior class over here right now than there are people in my hometown. And that makes for a very close, but also very sort of catty environment. Add into things like politics, family politics, historical trauma, your ACEs count, socioeconomic ability. It gets very hairy. A lot of the natives in the outlying communities are still coping with the trauma. I mean, I don't know how else to express that. My mother's generation was the generation of people that, taken from home, put into boarding school. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to really learn their culture because they had to learn how to live in the Western community now. And so they are what, I refer to as the lost generation. There's a lot of them trying to regain their culture and their history and their sense of community. And then there are others who they never found their way home. They never found their way back. I think that situation is similar for a lot of the outlying communities. I mean, they all experience that same trauma. These are families that are getting broken up. These are families that are getting abused in ways that, historically they'd never had to deal with before. The the tribes, they had their skirmishes, they had their wars, they had their enemies, they had their territories, but there was also an understanding between the tribes. At least that's the way I perceive it from my place in history. There was a lot of trading. There were a lot of attempts at peace and negotiation. The marriage structure within the tribes is, evidence of that. I mean, in the Tlingit culture, raven marries eagle. And, sometimes it's, a raven from one community marries, an eagle from another community, so that there's that bond there. A family from one community marries into a family from another community, so that there's that bond there. And that goes a long way into, tamping down on some of those non-essential, bickering and fighting that can sometimes happen when there's no tie between peoples. And so you've got a lot of mixed natives, Tlingit and Haida, Tsimshian, we've got up north natives mixed with southeast natives, and there was a lot of that going on. And that structure, that social structure that was getting built, get completely upturned with the introduction of Western culture. And, whereas in my household, the way it was always explained to me is, a man wasn't greater than a woman. They both had their places in life. They both had things that they were essential for. In my culture, it's matriarchal. You are what your mother was. And so women were highly valued. They were well protected. They were well cared for. They were essential. And you can't treat someone that is essential to your survival as less than you are. And in my grandmother and my grandfather's relationship, it wasn't perfect, but that was the basis for how they survived what they went through. Or that's what I'm given to understand by the conversations I had with my grandmother. And I think losing that disrupted a lot of things, because in Western culture, the male is the primary and is often considered of greater value than the female. And that puts a lot of things out of whack when your cultural identity is contrary to that. And so men went from being trained to value women as to seeing women as property, as to seeing women as less than you are. And then having to deal with but you're less too. A woman's less than you, but you're less than a white woman, which is less than a white man. And so having to reorient themselves in social space and time, it damaged a lot. And there are a lot of people who still haven't figured out how to walk the path between our culture, the native culture, and Western culture. And that's led to a lot of drinking. It's led to a lot of drug abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. I mean, if I remember correctly, Alaska leads the nation in suicide, sexual assault, child molestation, and, a lot of other very unpleasant things. And while there's the historical trauma aspect of it, there's the socioeconomic aspect to it too. I mean, in the community I grew up in, 500 people at its busiest. 250 of those, at least, work at the sports fisherman lodge. Once that place shuts down for the summer, you have the gas station, the school district, the store, the post office. Yeah, that's it. Those are the 4 places you can get jobs. There are others, the smaller ones, like the senior center, I mean, but places that are going to hire more than 2 or 3 people at a time are in short supply. So you've got a lot of people out there living on Social Security, living on, welfare, basically. And it's hard to see your life as positive. It's hard to feel like you're being productive and contributing when you can't provide for yourself. A lot of the people out in the community, they hunt and they fish and they gather and they work very hard to survive. And sometimes that's not enough, especially when you compare your life to what you're seeing on TV. I mean, you look at kids going on spring break and you wonder, well, why can't I do that? Well, you can't do that because your average annual income is $12,000 a year. I've genuinely no idea how my grandmother afforded to raise my sister and I in the village on hers and my grandfather's Social Security. I mean, I know we worked like dogs. I mean, preparing fish, preparing deer, preparing seal. I mean, there wasn't a time of year that we weren't working on something. And so I know that was a part of it. But yeah, my grandmother, she didn't apply for welfare when she had my sister and I. She didn't rely on social service programs to take care of us because she was afraid they were going to go after my mother. Which they would have. I mean, because she's technically the custodial person. The non-custodials are the ones that they attach for the money. Well, my mother was not particularly stable and didn't really have regular income, and it would have been very detrimental to her. And my grandmother didn't want to make her already difficult life harder. And so there are those considerations being made out in the communities too. I mean, if I apply for a help program, how is it going to affect, these other people? And sometimes you can't apply because there's not enough to go around. And so the socioeconomic aspect of it contributes greatly. If you can't sustain yourself and your family and the people that you care about, I mean, how do you feel productive? How do you feel whole? How do you feel successful? How do you see a future when all you can do is think about, if I don't get a deer today, we don't eat tomorrow. If I don't catch enough fish this summer, we're gonna starve this winter. I mean, it's really hard to see beyond the here and now when that's all you have time for. And that leads to a lot of drinking. And so drinking and drugs have been a great contributor to the situation too. A lot of people turn to drinking for things that they have no idea how to deal with. Like sexual abuse is a considerable issue in Alaska. I can't remember what the statistic was. It's like 3 in 5 women have experienced sexual abuse. If I remember correctly, I can't remember the stats on it. It's a ridiculous high rate. And in my family, I think there's maybe 3 women who haven't experienced some form of sexual abuse. And I don't even know what the statistic is in my family for what happened to the men, because that doesn't get talked about. And so you find ways to cope. And that's led to a lot of problems. And depression, I mean, once you start drinking and taking drugs and realizing that you don't know how you're going to find tomorrow when you can't get out of today, and you don't know your place in life because it's been altered so many times and there are so many different versions of where you're supposed to be, and you have no historical guidance for it anymore. There's no historical directive on how to be anymore. You start becoming detached. And once you lose that connection to community, to culture, to family, to self, it gets really easy to see suicide as a simple answer. You don't have to ask any questions. You don't have to answer any questions. I don't know if that's applicable for everyone, but from what I've seen, from my perspective, from the various conversations that I've had with people about the subject, that's what I take away from it.
So there's very little visibility of stories like this. What would you want to say to somebody who might be reading or watching your story, who identifies culturally with you, and that silence that they've had to carry around for whatever reason? What would you want to say to them, if anything?
I remember the code of silence very well. It was hard to agree to do this because of, the understanding, the unspoken understanding of the code of silence. A native person talking to a non-native person about problems in my family, problems with me, admitting that I have problems, that I can't take care of myself, admitting that I've made bad choices that have hurt people that I'm supposed to be taking care of. It's all very hard to grasp, to get over, to accept. But the thing that I think about when I think about that code is how, when I was disciplined as a child, or when I was sexually assaulted as a child, or, even my suicide attempts as a teen, I couldn't tell anybody about it. I couldn't do anything about it because nobody knew anything about it. And then when it happened to my sister, there was this unbelievable guilt in my life, because maybe if I had said something, somebody would know that that was an issue in my community. Maybe if I had said something to her about what had happened to me, even if I wasn't saying it to the community, even if I wasn't out there rallying against all of the wrongs and ills in the world, if I had had a conversation with her about it, I could have taught her how to be more careful. I could have shown her the signs. If I had not been so adherent to that code of silence, I could have helped prevent suffering to my sister. She was my first baby. She came home when I was 4, and I remember making her bottles, changing her diapers. I helped her do homework, and not being able to prevent her suffering because maybe I didn't say something, because in my community people wouldn't say something. That guilt, that level of guilt was, I'd never expected to feel something like that. And for my son, if I don't say something, if I don't share now, if I don't tell him about it, if I don't teach him not to be like that, he could be back in this cycle. They talk about, end the cycle, and it feels like, some fluffy sissy yaya thing that, non-issue people say to people with issues to, only you. And I understand the reluctance to accept it, because how could this person who knows nothing about you tell you something of value to you? But as one person who suffered to another, as one person who knows how these sorts of sufferings can contribute to your life and the lives around you, the best thing you can do, the most productive thing you can do, the bravest thing you can do is say something. Even if it's scary, even if it hurts, even if people are going to be mad at you about it. The bravest thing you can do is say something. And if this is the only kind of brave I can be, I feel good about that.
Has anything positive come out of your attempt?
The ability to speak about it. The recognizing that the code of silence is not helping us anymore. Like, I understand why we as a community and as a culture would adopt that protocol, that safety protocol for us. Because, they accused us of being savages because they didn't understand what our culture was and why it was. Like, they assumed we were worshipping the totem poles we put up, which wasn't the case, but they didn't understand that. And by us telling them about these things, they assumed things about us without understanding us. So I understand why we would adopt it and not want to share with people outside of the community. But I think we took it too far. And the finally being able to recognize that just because I'm talking about an issue doesn't make me a bad person. It doesn't mean I'm, betraying my community. I might be giving up the ghost on a couple of relatives, but I read something somewhere. Tell your story as you know it and as you feel it. And regardless of what other people say about it or how they feel about what you say. Because if they wanted to be a nice part of your story, they would have acted accordingly. When I found that, I was like, holy shit, really? Yeah. Like, if they wanted me to speak well of them, they would have treated me well. And they can't be mad at me for being honest about what they did or how they talked about me or to me. And I will have to come to terms that there are some people who won't speak well about me because of things that I've said or have done. But I won't feel bad about this because it has the potential to help someone. Just from my first attempt to now, I feel like I've grown a lot in my ability to understand what's going on in my head, how I react to different types of stress, and being able to address it before I get too low. I don't always catch myself before I hit bottom, but I do often enough that it's not the low lows. It's not the I can't get up in the morning lows. And I mean, I don't know if that's like a huge positive, but it's what I need. It's been good for me.
Is there anything you feel like I forgot to ask you? Anything you want to add?
I guess it would be for me, I am traditionally usually a pessimist, but I believe there's a small place in my head and my heart that hope resides. I don't feed it very often. I don't take very good care of it, I don't think. but it's always there. And even on my worst days, even in my most difficult situations, that little bit of hope to grasp onto, even if you can only hold it for a second, is essential. And I believe that most people have that. If you look hard enough, and if you focus on it, there's always one thing, one moment, one thought, one feeling, a smell, a taste that triggers that hope. For me, I've got lots of different things that trigger hope now. My son's laugh. From the time he was very little, his laugh has saved me so many times. The smell of sea air, like when you're out on a boat. The taste of fresh fried bread, like right out of the fryer. It's still hot and you practically burn your mouth off, but that taste. All of those little things that you find pleasure in, those are your connections to hope. Don't ignore them. Don't sweep them away. Don't dismiss them even when you're at your lowest. 'Cause that's you. That's some part of you wanting to survive. That's some part of you wanting to be there. Because if you can find pleasure in these things, then there is something that you like about your life. There is something to be here for. There's something to hold on to. And it might not be much, but sometimes all you need is a small something.